Sarah had always loved the independence that came with living alone. After years of sharing dorm rooms and noisy apartments with roommates, finally renting a small one-bedroom apartment near her college felt like freedom. The place wasn't fancy. It had creaky wooden floors, old radiators that hissed at night, and paper-thin walls, but it was hers. She decorated it with string lights, plants, and stacks of books, making it cozy enough to feel like a safe retreat from the chaos of campus life. On a late October night, Sarah sat propped up in bed, scrolling through her phone. The wind rattled the windows, and the occasional sound of laughter drifted up from the street below. She lived on the third floor of an older building, and though the area wasn't known for crime, she always made sure to lock her front door before bed. That night was no different. At least, that's what she thought. Around midnight, she put her phone down to stretch when she heard something faint, so faint she almost dismissed it. It sounded like the soft creak of a floorboard in the hallway just outside her bedroom. Her first thought was that it must have been one of the neighbors. Maybe the sound had carried through the thin walls. But as she held her breath, the sound came again, slower this time. A deliberate step. Her pulse quickened. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was just jumpy because she'd stayed up watching crime documentaries earlier. But then she noticed something that turned her blood cold. A dark shadow was spreading across the thin strip of light at the bottom of her bedroom door. Someone was standing there. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode out of her chest. Sarah's mind raced. She had locked the front door earlier, hadn't she? She was sure she had. She always double-checked, but there was no denying it now. Someone had made it inside. She moved as quietly as she could, reaching for her phone on the nightstand with trembling hands. Her fingers slipped once, the phone clattering softly against the wood. She froze, eyes glued to the door. The shadow didn't move away. Instead, the doorknob began to twist. Slowly at first, almost testing. Then harder, more forceful. Sarah's throat tightened. She dialed 911, whispering as soon as the dispatcher answered. "Someone's in my apartment," she breathed, her voice shaking uncontrollably. The woman on the other end stayed calm, asking for her address. Sarah gave it in hushed tones, straining to hear over the sound of the doorknob rattling. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line, to find a safe place to hide until officers arrived. Thinking fast, Sarah pushed her dresser against the door, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. Whoever was outside heard it, because suddenly the rattling grew violent. The door shook in its frame as if the intruder was throwing their weight against it. Sarah screamed, pressing her back against the dresser, trying desperately to hold it in place. "Stay with me," the dispatcher said firmly. "Police are on their way. Don't hang up." Minutes dragged on like hours. Sarah could hear her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her pulse in her ears, and the furious sound of someone trying to break through. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room went eerily silent. Sarah listened, barely daring to breathe. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, heavy and hurried, followed by the slam of her front door. The silence that followed was deafening. Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed outside her window. Sarah didn't move until officers banged on her door, identifying themselves. They had to break in, since the intruder had damaged her locks on the way out. When they searched the apartment, they confirmed her worst fear: the lock had been picked or tampered with. Whoever had entered her home had planned it. Sarah was left trembling as officers tried to reassure her. But nothing could erase the memory of that shadow under the door, the sound of the doorknob twisting, the weight of someone trying to force their way into her room. She packed a bag and stayed with a friend that night. In the morning, she broke her lease and made the decision never to live alone again. The apartment that once felt like freedom was now tainted with the memory of the night her sanctuary was invaded. And though she was safe, Sarah knew she'd never again hear the sound of a creaking floorboard without fear. James had always considered his neighborhood one of the safest places to raise a family. The houses lined up neatly on quiet streets, each with trimmed lawns and fences decorated with seasonal lights. Neighbors waved at each other every morning, and kids rode their bikes without fear in the afternoons. Crime was something James only ever saw on the news, not something he expected to knock on his own door. That illusion shattered one ordinary Tuesday night. It was late, close to midnight, when James finished tucking his 2 kids into bed. His wife, Emily, had already turned in, exhausted from a long day at work. James lingered in the hallway for a moment, listening to the soft sound of his children breathing, comforted by their innocence. Then he went downstairs, thinking he'd grab a glass of water before heading to bed himself. As he reached the kitchen, something felt off. The air was cooler than usual, and a faint draft touched his skin. His eyes immediately darted to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. It was slightly ajar, the curtain fluttering faintly with the breeze. His heart gave a nervous thump. He was sure he'd locked it earlier. He took a cautious step forward, and that's when he saw him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black, stood with his back turned, rummaging through the silverware drawer. In his gloved hands, he held something metallic that glimmered in the faint moonlight spilling in through the open door. James froze. For a split second, he thought maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, but the intruder turned then, looking up slowly. A black ski mask concealed his face, but his eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto James. The world seemed to hold its breath. Neither man spoke. Then, in a burst of motion, the intruder lunged toward him. James' instincts kicked in. He swung the glass water bottle he'd grabbed from the counter only seconds earlier. It missed the man's face by inches but shattered against the countertop, scattering shards across the floor. Heart hammering, James raised the jagged remains like a weapon. "Get out of my house," he shouted, his voice breaking with both fear and fury. Upstairs, his wife awoke to the commotion and screamed his name. Their children began crying. The masked man hesitated. For a terrifying moment, James thought he might still attack, that this stranger could push past him and go after his family. But then, the family's golden retriever came charging into the kitchen, barking ferociously. The burglar spun around to flee, his boots sliding on the shards of glass. In his panic, he tripped over the dog and slammed shoulder first into the sliding door. The glass rattled but didn't break, and with clumsy urgency, the intruder forced it open and bolted into the backyard. James rushed to the door, his heart pounding, but didn't dare chase him. His family's safety came first. He locked the door as best he could and rushed upstairs to check on Emily and the kids. They were huddled together, terrified but unharmed. Police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in streaks of red and blue. Officers combed the property and found footprints leading across the backyard into the wooded area beyond. The burglar was gone, swallowed by the night. When James gave his statement, the officers exchanged uneasy looks. It turned out several homes in the neighborhood had already been targeted in the past 2 weeks. Stolen electronics, jewelry, cash. But James was the only homeowner who had come face to face with the intruder. That detail made it worse. Knowing that the man had been inside his home, within feet of his children, was something James couldn't shake. The next day, he reinforced every lock in the house, installed new motion sensor lights outside, and bought a security system with cameras for every entry point. He even adopted a second dog, convinced that the first had saved them from something much darker. But even with the added security, James couldn't sleep the same way again. Every creak of the floorboards made him sit up. Every bump in the night sent him downstairs, clutching a baseball bat. He wasn't just protecting a house anymore, he was protecting the people who meant everything to him. The memory of those eyes behind the ski mask, the silent, threatening gaze of a man who didn't belong, stayed with him. He realized that the comfort of safety he once took for granted was fragile. One intrusion was all it took to destroy the peace of a home. And though the police assured him they were investigating, James knew the truth, the burglar was still out there. And that thought kept him awake at night. Carla had been a nurse for nearly 15 years, and she was used to long, exhausting night shifts. By the time she drove home at dawn, the world always felt strange, half asleep, half awake. Streets were empty, houses dark, and a blanket of silence hung over her suburban neighborhood. Her home, a modest two-story where she lived with her teenage son, Ethan, was usually the comfort she craved after 12 hours of fluorescent lights and ringing monitors. But on one particular morning, comfort was the last thing she found. Carla pulled into the driveway, yawning as she cut the engine. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, leaving everything bathed in a gray-blue haze. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. The front door, which she always locked before leaving for work, was slightly open. It stood ajar just enough to let in a thin sliver of light. Her stomach tightened. At first, she thought Ethan must have forgotten to lock it after coming home the night before. But when she stepped inside and called his name, the silence was deafening. No answer. The living room was exactly as she'd left it, couch cushions neatly in place, TV remote on the table, coffee mug in the sink. Nothing seemed out of order, but the air felt heavy, thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She took another cautious step inside. "Ethan," she called again, her voice cracking slightly. Still nothing. Carla set her bag down quietly and began walking toward the hallway. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Slow, deliberate breathing. Not her son's, it was heavier, rougher, the sound of someone lurking just out of sight. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The breathing was coming from her bedroom. Every instinct screamed at her to leave immediately, but she was frozen, her mind battling between fear for herself and fear for her son. She took a shaky step backward, intending to slip out the door and call the police, when the creak of a floorboard made her flinch. And then he appeared. A man emerged from the darkened doorway of her room. His clothes were filthy, his skin smudged with dirt, and his eyes bloodshot as though he hadn't slept in days. In one hand, he gripped a kitchen knife. His face twisted into something between a snarl and a grin, and for a moment, they just stared at each other in the dim light. Carla's survival instincts surged. Without a word, she spun and bolted out the front door, her lungs burning as she screamed for help. Neighbors, startled from their early morning routines, came rushing out. A man across the street called the police while another neighbor ran toward her, pulling her to safety. The intruder didn't follow. Instead, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed inside as he scrambled away, retreating deeper into the house. When police arrived minutes later, they swarmed the property. Carla stood shaking on the sidewalk, clutching her neighbor's arm, barely able to process what had just happened. Her only thought was Ethan. When officers searched, they found her son's bed untouched. He had spent the night at a friend's house, something Carla had completely forgotten in her panic. Relief nearly made her collapse. But what the officers discovered next chilled her to her core. The man hadn't just broken in that morning. He had been there for days. Up in the attic, police found a makeshift sleeping area, blankets, water bottles, food wrappers. The intruder had been living above them, sneaking down at night to steal from the kitchen. One officer explained that squatters sometimes hide in attics or basements for weeks without being noticed, watching the residents, waiting for opportunities. Carla's hands shook as she listened. The thought that this stranger had been living only a few feet above her and her son, watching them, waiting, was enough to make her skin crawl. The knife he carried suggested he wasn't just there for shelter. At some point, his intentions had turned darker. The man was caught hours later, wandering nearby streets in a daze. He had a history of mental illness and prior arrests for trespassing. But knowing he was off the streets didn't erase the horror Carla felt. Her house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every corner seemed like a place he might have been hiding, every creak in the floorboards a reminder of the breathing she'd heard in the dark. That same day, She packed what she could and took Ethan to stay with her sister. They never returned to that house again. Carla's life moved forward, but the memories stayed with her. As a nurse, she had seen countless people at their most vulnerable, but she had never felt as vulnerable herself as she did in her own home, confronted by the realization that danger had been living just above her head. And from that day on, she never stepped into a dark, silent house without a shiver of fear creeping down her spine.